So the first thing I think we should talk about is how you would define racism. And obviously, the context is so different for all three of us. I don't want to. I don't want to use generic terms, but we all come from different parts of the world. I'm Indian. You one of you is you're American. You're African. And there's obviously different things you're taught, I guess, about racism as we're growing up. So yeah, I'm very interested in knowing how you guys perceive racism.
Sylvain, you want to start us off?
Why not? Well, to me, racism is any form of discrimination or prejudice based on your ethnicity or your race. That's how I see it.
Yeah, I think it's the same for me. Growing up in the southern part of the U.S., I think I generally associated racism just with black and white, just because that was the context of where I was growing up, and because there was quite a lot of history around racism, somebody that just on the basis of their race or ethnicity.
A definition I came across is how racism is the belief that a particular race is superior or inferior to another, and that a person's social and moral traits are predetermined by his or her inborn biological characteristics.
Mm.
But do you think the way I see it...
Interesting. That's like...
Yeah, no, go on.
No, go ahead.
No, you go.
No, I think it's a really maybe the underlying. It gets to sort of the undercurrent of racism, which is that you're making a judgment against somebody. It almost starts to verge into the area of like stereotype and expectations of other people based on their race or their ethnicity.
I mean, the way I see it, India was under British colonialism for a very long time, and a lot of the way my country is today, a lot of that has to do with how we were taught to behave and how we were taught to react. The fact that I can't survive in India without knowing English, and I can survive without knowing Hindi, which is the national language, that says something. But is it just to do with the historical context? Or is there something more to the fact that we think we are superior or inferior to another?
I think it might have something to do with the history of the country, the region, but not always. And saying that, I can think of the Rwandan genocide. If you think about the Tutsis and the Utsis, they're all black, but then one thinks that the other race is lower. I don't know if history has anything to do with that, but I think it's just the way people perceive themselves, just take themselves to be superior than others. And I a couple months ago, I was reading a scientific paper about how people think that black people have low IQ. I don't know if history has anything to do with that, but there are people who actually think that black people are less intelligent than any other race. So yeah, I think it has more to do with people's beliefs, but then I don't know if beliefs are shaped by history or not.
I think it's almost impossible not to have it be shaped by history. I mean, you know, if you think of for me, I feel like the genesis of racism is the context in which somebody grows up. Like, within the context of their family, within the context of their social interactions growing up, they are exposed to explicit and implicit forms of racism, I guess. And I'm just thinking about like one of the big debates that's been coming up as a result of the protests and of the recent response to police violence in the States has been much more discourse about the way in which the system in America has racism like embedded in it. So, the way you grow up, you're exposed to these ideals. Sometimes it's explicitly from what you hear from your parents or your friends or what you're taught at school, and then sometimes it's implicitly based on how you see a system operating or how you have to struggle within a system, maybe.
When you say it's embedded, what do you mean? Like, is it in terms of like your education or just the way you're brought up?
Yeah, I mean, to give an example from the States, for a long time there was sort of a legal doctrine of separate but equal. This idea that you could have separate schools for African Americans, and so even though legally it said that they were supposed to be equal to that of white schools, in practice, in reality, they weren't. So even if you grow up in that society, you see embedded in the structures of society, you see racism. You see a discrepancy between what African Americans get and what white people get. You see embedded in that society the fact that judges, prosecutors, police officers, figures of authority, politicians, elected politicians, CEOs of companies, you see the vast majority of those are white people. So whether or not you yourself would identify as racist, there's an argument that the system itself is racist. So that's what I mean by embedded, or that's the argument I would say for it.
But then how do you know that racism is wrong? Like, if it's so deep into the American society and it's in the whole structure and the infrastructure of the American value system, at least it used to be, how do people like you end up finding a way to educate yourself and understand the nuances of it, and maybe even understand why it is not okay to be racist in no matter the context?
I mean, I think it's true for any individual that grows up in this situation, whether you're in, whether you're growing up in Rwanda as part of an ethnic group, or you're growing up in the US. Like, the issue is, at some point you recognize the unequal treatment of other people in your own culture, in your own society, and you start to question why that's the case, right? That's the recognition. I think that's what you're talking about. That moment of recognition comes when you yourself recognize something as being unfair, unequal. And I think for a lot of people, it happens as soon as you have a close friend or something, or you grow up and you're kids and you're playing with other people and suddenly something happens. I think you hear this a lot. It's a common narrative, but you're playing together and then, something happens where you suddenly see that either you're not being treated the same as somebody else, or you see that they're not being treated the same as you. And suddenly it crystallizes this into like somebody else is being treated differently and you don't maybe you don't necessarily understand why at that point, but those are the sort of things that I think add up to that awareness being raised.
Sylvain?
Well, yeah, you asked JT how one would know why racism is wrong. I like to see slavery, for example, as being one of the consequences of racism. And back then, we had even white people who were not enslaved, but who fought against the concept. How did they know that it was wrong? It doesn't take any special mindset to see the sufferings of people. If you look at the way George Floyd was murdered, you had white people, black people standing around screaming at the police officer to let go of him, not because they necessarily knew that it was wrong, but they could see that the guy on the ground was suffering. He was agonizing, but how did they know it was wrong? Because they saw him suffer. That's how I think one can know that it is wrong, even though you do not have the necessary education um, um, to distinguish between what is wrong and what is right about racism. As long as you are a human being and you can feel the impact on the other person, I think that is enough for you to know that it is wrong from that very moment.
Hey, Sylvain, I'm interested in knowing, to go back to a previous question that Yadger asked. When you were growing up in Burkina Faso, what was your conception, or did you have a conception of racism growing up? Like, what would have been your connection to that terminology?
I didn't have much exposure to racism growing up as a kid in Burkina Faso. All I knew about the concept is what I learned in my history classes about how France colonized Burkina Faso and how they treated our ancestors based on their race. That's kind of the idea I had about racism growing up. And then I also heard about how light-skinned Africans tend to discriminate against Black Africans. And that's kind of the idea I had about racism growing up. I did not have the explicit exposure to the issue.
Mm.
Do you want to talk a little bit about what you just mentioned about light-skinned Africans being racist towards Black Africans? Because that's something I've never personally heard about. Like, I've heard about it, but I've never been in a context where I've been aware of something like that. When most people who are I come from India, so racism is not an issue per se here. It's more to do with when Indians leave India. So when I'm taught about racism, and when I was taught about racism, it was very much to do with white versus black. So for me, it's very interesting to, yeah. Why don't you talk about what you just said?
Yeah, sure. I can tell you that it is still prevalent in most of the northern African countries, countries such as Morocco, Algeria, and all those Arabic countries. They literally discriminate against Black people. And it is so that even the idea of Black being bad is ingrained in people's mind right now. If you go to Burkina Faso, you see people buying lotions to apply to their skin to become lighter. That's how much it has gone deep into people's mind. And as I'm speaking now, racism is still ongoing in Northern Africa. And the best case studies to me are Algeria and Morocco. They tend to identify it as not being African because of their skin color. And because of that, at some point, Morocco tried to integrate the European Union because they didn't want to identify as African because they're white. Yeah, but people tend not to look at that because racism is mostly known as being more pronounced in the US, but it is also happening on the African continent. Even back then, I learned in my history class that countries such as Libya um, had slaves back then when colonization was happening and slavery was ongoing. There were people in Libya, not necessarily European, but they were Arabs, and they decided to engage in the slave trade. But they wouldn't enslave their own people, but black people, because they have a lighter skin and they believe that they are superior to all those black people. So yeah.
Hey guys, thank you so much for watching. What was the first episode of a show that I'm very, very proud of. Yes, I am in the kitchen. I just couldn't find a better angle thing. Sorry. Yeah, I'm a show that I'm very proud of, not just because I'm doing something in quarantine, but also because I learned so much just by one Zoom call from two of the most amazing people I know, two of the most self-aware people I know, and two of the most smartest people I know. And it was just very interesting to have both sides of the spectrum. If you did learn something, please do share it with people you know because it's a conversation that needs to continue to happen until racism isn't a thing anymore. And if you did enjoy it, please leave a comment. If you want to say something for the next podcast, if you want to know more about something, or if you want somebody particular to be featured, please do let me know.